Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome along to our Royal Scottish Forestry Society online talk. It's wonderful to see so many people here this evening for what promises to be a fascinating topic. I'm Kat Wilson, the Executive Director of RSFS, and I'm very excited for us to be hosting one of our first online events. So many of you already take part in and enjoy our in-person events, our field days, our CPD events, and our annual study tour. So I hope you find these online events of value too. And as this is one of our first, please do let me know if you have any feedback on the format or any ideas for future topics. And you can always email me at director@rsfs.org.uk. And if you're new to RSFS tonight, a particularly warm welcome. I think we might have members of the Community Woodland Association and also the Native Woodland Discussion Group here tonight. So it's great to have you here with us. And if you'd like to find out more about what we do and events you're welcome to join us at, please do look at our RSFS website. In terms of the format for this evening, Rob wanted this event to be relatively informal, with cameras on if possible so that he can see you. If a question comes to you whilst he's speaking, feel free to type it into the chat box, or we can wait until the end when hopefully we'll have some time for a Q&A. So it's great pleasure for RSFS to introduce Professor Rob Wilson for this evening's talk. Rob is an expert in dendrochronology, the science of tree rings, and is a professor at the University of St Andrews. So in particular, Rob looks at what tree ring archives can tell us about the drivers of climate and environmental change. And he's carried out local and regional studies in Europe, North and South America, and Australasia, and closer to home in our very own Cashel Forest. So today he's going to tell us all about what dendrochronology is and how it can be applied, and his research in particular on pine chronologies and more recently oak. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks for the introduction, Kat. I'll share my screen. Hopefully you might see yourselves first, but okay, no, you should be able to see the talk there. I think I'll just move that to the. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, you're all on that screen now, so I'll keep looking at this screen and hopefully you can see my pointer because I'll be sort of highlighting aspects. So hopefully this will be sort of targeted about right. I'm going to kind of give you an overview of dendrochronology and how it's being used in Scotland, not just by me, but by also collaborators and also my students. So this is a sort of veneer of some of the work that's been done over the last 20 years or so. As a brief introduction, I should probably say who I am. Let's just make this up. So actually, I define myself as a paleoclimatologist. So I use tree ring archives to study past climate. So that's my primary aim in my research. And then aspects of ecology are often the noise for what I do. I'm focusing on the climate where all the rich ecological information that many ecologists would want to be is kind of the stuff that I don't want to have. So I will be touching on a lot of that because you'll see why you can't ignore it when ecological signals and disturbance signals are quite prevalent in many of the archives that we're generating. So I'm going to start off with some very quick basics about what dendrochronology is, and I think that will give you an appreciation of what we can do with dendrochronology, not just within Scotland, but anywhere in the world where there is a tree growing. Every tree will have a story, essentially, and it's trying to understand what that story is within individual trees, and then stands of trees, and then even large forests and systems as well. So just to break this down to its basics, if we look at the etymology of yes, it was a dry suit. That might yeah, okay, I'll try and keep my eyes on the questions as well as they come in. So yeah, we'll talk about the lake work or the loch work in the talk as well. Okay, so dendrochronology is essentially dendron, tree, chronos, time, and then the study of, right? So essentially dendrochronology is the science of dating tree rings and then interpreting the information within them. And in temperate regions or in regions where we have very strong seasonal cycles of winter, summer, so forth, then this works very well. If you go to the tropics, when there may be multiple seasons or continuous growth, then traditional dendrochronology becomes very difficult. So I'm really focusing on the sort of mid to high latitudes environments and high elevation conifers or lowland deciduous systems and so forth. So dating is fundamentally the aspect here, and this is a schematic picture or kind of trying to portray how we build long chronologies from which we can do environmental science. So on the right hand side here is the most recent period where we'll sample um, uh, uh, sample several trees. So if we focus initially on pine trees in Scotland, we might sample using some sort of core, maybe 30 trees from a site. We can then pattern match the barcode of wide and thin rings. We can synchronize them together, ensuring they're dated. We know the outer ring is the most recent growth year. And then, most trees in Scotland are around, 200, 250 years old. Some are longer, some are substantially younger, of course. But if we want to then build chronologies back in time, we need to find not only preserved material, woody material of the same species, but also those timbers must have grown roughly in the same region. So we can go to buildings, for example, and as long as the buildings are made with local timbers and pine trees and so forth, then hopefully there is an overlap between the timber sequences in those buildings with the early parts of the living chronologies. And then you can see how we can build a chronology going back in time, and we're essentially pattern matching the sequences, the ring width data, or whatever we measure from them. And so within an area, you need to find preserved material. So you might have relatively recent buildings from the 19th and the 18th century, and you can work your way back to the medieval period. Then at some point, you're going to then run out of buildings, and then you've got to find other archives. And within the Scottish framework that we've been doing and the work we've been doing, we've been going into the lochs and the peat materials. And as long as you've got material that's well preserved, you can go back as far back in time as you've got material. And as you'll see, we've got evidence within Scotland of being able to go back theoretically 8,000 years, although we're nowhere close for that kind of continuous chronology for Scotland. So I'll come back to this concept of dating because it's quite important as we move forward. What I want to focus on is really how we extract information from tree ring samples. So I'm going to focus mostly in this talk on Scots pine because that's most of the work I've focused, or the species I've focused on at least within Scotland over the last sort of almost 20 years. But at the end, I'm going to briefly finish off just a brief mention of a new project that's basically only about 2 years in, where we're focusing on oak. Because essentially we don't really know so much about oak and how oak productivity changes over time. And when I mean over time, we're talking centuries and potentially longer. So, and just don't panic, there's not going to be much maths here. This is a conceptual model, but I just wanted to highlight that there are multiple environmental factors that modulate the growth of trees. Okay, so the growth of trees essentially is an aggregation of many variables or many environmental variables that can quicken growth or slow growth depending on location, species, etc. So we of course have some sort of climatic influence, and me as a climatologist, I normally target trees where one climate variable will dominate growth. So in the Scottish Highlands for Scots pine, if we go up close to tree line up in the mountains, then the predominant climatic factor there is summer temperatures. So tree line exists because above tree line it's too cold for cell formation, so there's no tree growth. And in a warming world, that tree line is of course going up slope. But at the same extreme, we could go down to drier regions like, say, central England. There might not be pine trees there, but there might be oak trees. And there's more of a drought signal because it's just a dry climate. We could go to the American Southwest, and then the trees are extremely moisture limited. Okay, so location, species are extremely important and very strategic sampling to basically maximize the climate signal. Then with my climate hat on, then the next two factors are kind of what I would call the disturbance signals. So these might be endogenous signals, which are more kind of tree specific. So every tree will have its own noise or own signals related to local factors like lightning strike, or a neighboring tree dies and there's an opening in the canopy. So single trees might respond slightly differently to environmental factors. And then we might have then stand-wide effects that could be related to fire, insect attack, disease, pollution, or whatever that might then affect many, many trees within a woodland area. And then trying to tease out these different sort of tree-specific or stand-specific factors really requires us to sample many, many trees at a particular site, so at least 30, and then also to sample networks of trees, so we can then identify anomalous woodlands versus other woodlands that may be more kind of control states that are behaving in some sort of climatological way. That depends on what the question of your study is going to be. And as you'll see as I move forward here, all of these factors become really important. Now, this is highly simplified, right? I'm not a forester, and I'm sure many of you in this virtual room will go, oh well, there's many factors that affect productivity. Well, of course there are, right? We could expand this conceptual. We could add in allometric aspects about the tree form and height growth versus girth expansion, nutrient availability, how that changes over time, carbon allocation, right? Is the carbon that's sequestered each year, is that going into the stem or the branches or the leaves, or is it actually a masting year? Or you might have genetic type changes, not only over time, but also over space. So it's very complicated. Absolutely, I won't deny that. However, the reality is, despite this complexity, tree rings is one of the more fundamental archives for understanding environmental change for at least the last 1,000 years around the Northern Hemisphere and the temperate regions of the Southern Hemisphere as well. And in fact, this complexity opens up dendrochronology to all sorts of sub-disciplines and really depends on the questions you're trying to address. So you could be a geomorphologist and use tree ring archives to study glacial movements, debris flows, avalanches, even earthquakes. Any of these phenomenon that impacts growth in some way, it could be killing the trees, tilting the trees, etc., etc. Then you can see the pattern related to those phenomena within the rings, and then you can date them and understand them. And the same goes for flood frequency analysis, fire history, and then we get to dendroecology, which is probably the biggest subdiscipline in dendrochronology. And then you can look at insect outbreaks, simple forest stand dynamics, and the tree age structures of woodlands and how they change over space, pollution, and so forth. And then, of course, what I focus normally on is dendroclimatology. So in this talk, I'm really going to be focusing on, actually, I'm not focusing really on dendroclimatology, but I'm going to sort of talk about the ecological and the so-called disturbance signals that make my life as a climatologist much more complicated. Okay. So, oh, that didn't work too well. So imagine we've got we call this now the archive, right? We've got whether it's a tree core or a disc from a dead tree, and we can measure many parameters or different variables for wood. We can measure the ring width. That's relatively cheap to do nowadays. We can measure wood density. Now, wood density is really important. Between the ring width and the wood density, then we can actually calculate how much carbon is being sequestered in the trees. But also within the ring of a tree, the density is not the same. So if we look at just a single ring here, this is this figure here. So every time you see a ring, on conifers at least, you have this initial light wood, the so-called early wood, which is essentially relatively large cells with thin cell walls and a large lumen. So the space in the cell is large. And then as you get towards the end of the growing season, so we're getting into sort of July and August and maybe early September, then the cells get more compacted, the cell walls are thicker, and then the density increases. So if you measure the density through a single ring of a conifer tree, at least, then you get this sort of pattern from low density to high density. And the density parameters have been really, really important for the work from dating and also with regards to climate work as well. Other variables you can measure, stable isotopes, so oxygen and carbon are usually the ones that are used for, again, climatological purposes, but also for dating. And I'll briefly talk about dating as well. And then finally, although probably the most expensive of all these methods is actually to do very detailed wood anatomical measurements, where you're actually then measuring cell size or cell area, cell wall thickness, and all sorts of varieties of metrics. And from the quantitative wood anatomy, then you can measure true density through the trees as well. So there's an arc going down here of increased cost, both in analytical cost, but also in technician time as well. So I can train a student very easily to measure ring width and get the dating correct, but to get someone to measure quantitative wood anatomy requires a very expensive equipment and months and months and months of training as well. So because of the sort of cheap aspect, most of the work that we've done in Scotland is focused on ring width and the density parameters that we can measure from wood. And as you'll see from what I show here, we can do a lot with those parameters. So for the sake of this talk, I want to focus on ring width and density. So ring width is the big aggregator parameter, meaning that the ring width essentially is a product of the productivity of the tree for a particular year. And the ring width is a function of the climate, the site ecological situation, and any disturbances that may or may not be happening for individual years. Okay, so ring width is a very complicated parameter if you're trying to model it and trying to understand what's driving the variability in ring width from year to year. Where if we go to ring density, and especially say the late wood density in conifers, then the density is actually tightly coupled to the climatology of the site. Again, location is very important, but say at high elevations in the Scottish Highlands for Scots pine, then the late wood density parameter is very tightly coupled to late summer temperatures, sort of July, August temperatures. And it's this relationship that we can use to come up with reconstructions of past summer temperatures. But even early wood width, where those low density values are, can give us actually temperature information for, say, February and March as well, the very, very early part of the growing season for these trees. Again, location is important in all of this. So I'm going to try and follow the title of the talk here. So I'm going to talk about dating again. I talked about the concept of dating, but it's really fundamental. If we can, or anything you do with dendrochronology, whether you're doing geomorphological processes, climate or ecology, we can promise that we will have the ring dated to an exact calendar year, right? As long as we can build chronologies back from the present going back in time. And that's really important. If we're trying to date a building or date a geomorphological event, and we can say, well, the first year of growth after that fire was this year. So now within dendrochronology itself, dating or historical or archaeological dating was probably its first major use almost 100 years ago over in the lab in Arizona, in the Tucson lab. They realized that you could use the sort of climatically driven variability in tree ring archives to date Native American structures. Now, within Scotland, Coralie Mills of Dendrochronicle and Anne Crone of AOC Archaeology, and Coralie also was at AOC Archaeology, they've done much of the sort of grunt work over the last 30 years to get dendrochronology onto the sort of into the marketplace with regards to sort of dating historical structures. And just an example of some of the work they've done, and my group later came in. This is just an example. This is Baden Cottage. It's near King Craig over towards the Cairngorms. And this is a typical crook frame kind of croft structure that is relatively rare nowadays, but more often than not are built using local timbers. So we did a project about 10 years ago using new variables, the density variables here, to date some of these structures, because the ring width signal was so complicated that they really struggled to date pine using just ring width alone. So if we go back to this figure I showed before here, essentially we are now starting to do sort of statistical matches where we're trying to find good overlaps between living material and then the timbers that we take out of these buildings. And if you look at one of their reports with regards to dating, you'll probably see some figure like this that will show a sort of plot, a time series plot of, in black is the reference chronology, and then in red is the data, the ring width data from the timbers they took out of the building. And yeah, if you're into the statistics, the R value is 0.5, but you can see there's a qualitatively good match here. Okay. Now the reality is that this is not a qualitative exercise. There's actually a lot of statistics behind this kind of dating. And in fact, what we're trying to do is we're doing sort of sliding correlations and trying to find a peak of unique correlation. In this case, it's mapped onto the T distribution here, where we can definitively say that the outer ring of this phase chronology from this, in this case, this cottage, was 1801. Okay. Now, this is sort of ring width based dating and has been the bread and butter for many archaeological labs for probably at least 50 years. Now, in the last 10 years, I've been expanding on this, trying to think about, well, we're not measuring just ring width here, we're measuring all these other variables, and essentially at the same time as we're measuring ring width. And now we have this multi-parameter world where we can improve the dating. So the details don't really matter here, but here's the same results here, where we've got these sliding correlation results through time. This is the result for ring width. But then if we use the early wood density or the late wood density, or we combine all three parameters, then we increase our confidence, and each time we get exactly the same date, but using essentially independent variables. So we can do really robust dating now of woody material, so long as it's local, right? As soon as wood is then imported from Scandinavia, then we need, of course, reference chronologies from Scandinavia, or even North America if wood was being imported from New England, which is something that's been. So this is a very new method. It's still going through review at the moment, but we have rebuilt the whole Scottish archive using this multi-parameter approach here, and I'm going to be talking about subfossil material in a minute, and we've been dating the subfossil material using the same methodology now. So as a climatologist, okay, you can find some buildings and so forth, but if we really want to go back in time, we want to find old remnant material that's actually preserved almost in situ. So in many of the lochs in the Northern Cairngorm, so Rothiemurchus through Glenmore into Abernethy and up in Glen Affrig, these lochs and small lochans are full of wood and preserved wood. Now, they may not all naturally be died in situ. They might have been part of the logging processes over recent centuries, but there is a beautiful archive in some of these lochs where the wood can be quite well preserved. Then, of course, there's the peat environment here. So this is just a picture from Glen Inach up in the Cairngorms here, where we found substantial material that's quite early on in the Holocene. And this is a picture of my office of about 10 years ago, and you can see we've sampled many thousands of discs of timbers from many locations around the Highlands, and it's a real jigsaw piece, and it's a jigsaw through time. So from this archive, we did quite a bit of carbon dating over the years, and this is really focused mainly on Glen Affrig and the Cairngorms, Northern Cairngorms. And then this is the distribution. So to the right is 0 of present day, and then this is years before present. And going back 8,000 years, we have actually quite a lot of material. And this is just material that my lab has collected. If we added all the carbon dates of all the bog pine material that's been found in Rannoch and up in the flow countries, then we actually have hundreds of carbon dates filling most of the Holocene, or the last 8,000 years or so. So there's a huge potential of building an archive going back in time. And for my work, I've been really focused mostly on the last 2,000 years. And only in the recent last 5 or 6 years, we've started pushing back now and started looking at this sort of pre 1 BC period here as we go further back in time, because this is a very exciting period. So I will show you some brief results coming up here. So this is just a plot of what we call the Northern Cairngorm and Glen Affrig chronology. So this is a continuous chronology going from essentially 2024. And this is the living period here. So this is just the same data presented in different ways. This is the replication through time. And then we got lots and lots of material from the sort of 18th and the 19th century here. That reflects a lot of timber cutting through this period, both in Rothiemurchus and Glen Affrig. And then we've got a fading amount of material as we go further and further back in time. But this is in a process of being built. Okay, we've got lots and lots of undated material. The map and the preservation is not always so good, but we've almost got 1,000 years chronology, and actually we're pretty close to going the full 2,000 years. We have this annoying gap from about 800 to 1,000 that, although I have carbon dates in this period, the quality of the samples for this period, for whatever reason, are not very good. So we're really struggling getting the dating through that period. This is some work from a PhD student of mine. This is a chronology here. It's a slightly different figure here. So the black line is the chronology of just ring width here. The grey line is just the number of samples here. This is the scale. So we've got lots of samples going here. And this is from Glen Inach in the Northern Cairngorms. I've already mentioned this. But what we have here is we have the kind of the early mid-Holocene climate maximum expansion of the woodlands at this period. And these woodlands came in at this element. We're about 500 meters above sea level here. The woodlands came in around 7,800 years ago. And there was this sort of period of, not quite 1,000 years or so, where we had a profound forest in the area, quite dense. Some examples, we have quite a lot of stumps through this period. Then we have very little material for a few hundred years. We have a couple of carbon dates in here, but no traditional cross dating. And then we have another final pulse. Now, most of this material is what we would define as bog pine trees, although when you look at the properties in them, some of them are actually mineral soil trees here. So it's quite mixed, especially in this early period, which we assume was warmer, drier, where this latter period before the woodland finally died out around 6.6 thousand years ago, then you can see that the trees really crashed at the end. And just Althea Davis is a co-supervisor on this study here. This is Althea coring a modern bog pine tree. This tree here is 200 years old. And this is a site that we define as an extreme bog pine tree. It's 50% of the trees have died on this location and represents this extreme limit where any changes in the hydrology can really impact the trees and the growth here. So this is really exciting. This is new stuff. And the nice thing with Kaylee's work is that we're actually done peat cores at the same time. So we're doing the palynology through this to give us the continuous record over the last 8,000 years as well. So matching those two records together is really generally quite exciting. I should say that we have a similar study as part of this PhD over in the Karura estate, where we've got the tree ring archive is not quite as good as this, but we've got a beautiful pollen record, but the story is completely different. So the story in the high elevations and the cairngorms is really giving us kind of what we think is the natural signal of pine woodland change over time. And then Karura and these other kind of slightly lower elevation locations, and especially as we go out west, then we start getting the human influence substantially in these. And they're not just pine woodlands, they're much more mixed with deciduous and so forth. So there's a very complex story here when we start putting all of this together. So this figure here shows the number of pine woodlands that we have sampled since about, well, let's say over the last 20 years. So each dot represents a cluster of about 20 to 30 trees that we have sampled. And you can see in some areas they're incredibly dense because we've had lots of studies trying to compare many different woodlands together, try and understand the disturbance signals that I'm going to be briefly talking about. And then in some locations, we've actually sampled maybe more than 100 trees because this is the areas where we're getting the subfossil material from and so forth. So in fact, the two main areas where we've been going into the lochs to get subfossil material is what I call the northern cairngorm. So that's Rothiemurchus through to Abernethy, and then multiple lochans and lochs within the Glenafrig region here. And they cross-date and they date very well between these regions. So now that's dating and long chronology building. I want to now move over to the disturbance story, because probably for the ecologists in the virtual room here, this is probably maybe more of interest. So trees, as I say, they respond to climate, but they respond to disturbance, whatever that disturbance is. So this is just a scan of a Scots pine tree here, and you can see the very recent period here that it gets extremely suppressed, and for some reason it grows really slowly, and there's obviously some trauma here, so something's happened within this tree that's caused that tree to crash. Now, when we first started doing this work, and basically about in 2007, I was working with Colin Edwards and Coralie and Anne, and we started off in Glenafrig because they were trying to extend chronologies up in the sort of northern central highlands. And it very quickly became clear that there was some very odd anomalous growth trends in the samples that we were taking out of the trees. So this first plot here is what I would call the classic growth form, where you see a sort of, if you see a stump of a tree, and you generally have wide rings in the middle, and then as the tree's getting bigger, then the amount of carbon that's been sequestered kind of gets smeared out as the girth's getting growing. And you see that in the ringworts with this kind of negative exponential function. And we normally fit that with some sort of function like that black line, and we can detrend it, and then all the variability that's left over is the ecological signal plus the climate signal. And you can see that's actually steadily showing an upward trend here. That's probably a response to the warming in the region. So this is kind of a tree that's growing in a nice open woodland, no disturbance, no competition with neighbours and so forth. And, you know, if you go to the northern tree line in Scandinavia, you would see this form very easily. But this is actually a very rare tree up in Glenafrig and much of the Highlands. So we can see examples of trees that show these growth forms. So here we have a tree that when it germinated, and when it was in a sort of juvenile phase for the first sort of 50 or 80 years or so, it was actually competing for light with a much more dominant set of trees around it. And then after about 80 years, it becomes co-dominant and then starts following this sort of exponential, negative exponential sort of decline in relative ringwidths going through. And that's fine. And you can see that quite a lot when you've got mixed age classes and a continuous woodland of mature trees dying and new trees coming in and so forth. But another signal that we saw in Glen Affric was this very sharp increase that we constantly kept seeing. So we had this early suppressed period and then suddenly this huge release in growth. And they were always at a consistent time around the sort of 1810s to 1830s, and it varied a bit between sites and so forth. But Glen Affric was the first area. So in this example, what actually it turns out is that what we're seeing is the response of a tree that has survived a timber clearing event. So maybe 50% of the trees have been taken out, or maybe even more. And then the trees that are remaining, in this case, it would have been a very young sapling, just accelerates. It has all this extra light, it has all these extra nutrients, and then it goes ballistic for a few years, and then it then starts acting like it would do if it was just on its own in an open canopy, and then starts decreasing. But for the climatologist, this sort of waveform is an absolute nightmare to try to counteract, because we were looking for trends of climate and not trends of disturbance. So about sort of 15 years ago, at a meeting, I came across this forest ecologist called Dendrochronology, who was looking at this very problem of sort of disturbance. And he was interested in disturbance from a silviculture point of view, because he wanted to quantify how much extra carbon trees would put on if you managed the woodland by thinning and so forth, so they would release and increase growth and so forth. And what he actually did, which was amazing, is he came up with this modeling approach that could model what the trees would have done without the disturbance, which is this dashed line here. And then you can map that with the actual growth release that you see in the tree when you sample it. Now, he was interested in the difference between these two lines, because that gave you an estimate of the extra carbon that those trees were being put on. What he didn't realize was that kind of dashed line represents the so-called corrected tree of what the tree would have done without the disturbance. Now, it might not be perfect, but it certainly minimizes this. And so I was chatting with him over a beer, and I said, well, actually, that's kind of correcting it. That would kind of remove that disturbance. And at the same time, we get this information of disturbance. So we had this two bits of information that we could derive from this. And actually, the difference between the two we defined as a so-called disturbance chronology. So we applied this method to all the pine woodlands around the Highlands. This was published around 2016. And the red line here is the so-called disturbance chronology. So this is just a chronology from Glengarry, which is a particularly disturbed pine woodland. There's sort of 3 remnant patches in that area. It's not a very happy pine woodland, I'm afraid, but it's a good example here. And we see this initial disturbance period early on in the chronology around the early 19th century. It's the classic what I would call the classic Western signal. But also we see another pulse of disturbance around the 1920s and 1930s as well in the 20th century. So we did this for all the woodlands, and if we compile all this information together, what became apparent is this is just a histogram of the disturbance events, and the dark brown is for the cairngorms and the orange is for the Western network. So we're talking sort of, from Redoric in the north down to Glenorchy in the south, but on the western side. And what became apparent is this so-called disturbance response was prevalent from the mid-17th century right through to the sort of late 19th century, but it was the expression of disturbance was much stronger in the west than it was in the east or in the cairngorms. Now, whether that represents that there was more timber clearance in the west compared to the cairngorms, or whether the western pine trees for some reason were more sensitive to roughly the same amount of timber clearance, that was never resolved. But I will come back to that near the end of this talk, because I believe that the western trees are much more sensitive to changes in the environment. And you'll see what I'm saying as we get close to the end of the talk. So there's a huge amount of information if we want to actually study past woodland dynamics now. So there's lots of evidence. We can, from living trees and also subfossil material, and theoretically even the historical archive from buildings, if we wanted to bring that in, we can look at the start dates of the first year, the pith date. That gives us sort of information on regeneration rates and so forth. We can look at the death dates that are at least represented in the trees that are in these things. Are they natural death or is it anthropogenic death because they've been cut down? There's some caveats here because the samples may degrade over time because the sapwood is rotting. Then we've got Dan's disturbance statistical method that can identify periods of so-called disturbance. And in this case, we're only looking at release events, because that represents a thinning in the canopy, but you could look at suppression in the same way. And then we also actually, in many of the samples, we could see direct evidence of human intervention, i.e. we see saw cuts or axe hacks on the trees as well. So if we put all that together, we can start building up a picture about potentially timber clearance in different regions. So if we go back here, this is the long Cairngorms chronology here. So I don't include Glenafric here because that has a slightly different story. We can, from the tree ring data, we can look at the mean tree age through time. So at the recent period here, the mean tree age is about 150 years. But you can see periods when, from the samples that we have, right? Remember, it's a spotty jigsaw with gaps and so forth. But there are periods when basically there was almost no data. It was like, oh, the trees are increasing, and suddenly a crash. So something's happening in this record. We can look at periods where there is regeneration or recruitment in these areas. So we get these pulses of recruitment. We can then look at the death dates. So these are all 20-year sort of histogram boxes going back in time. We can then look at the disturbance information from the statistical method of DANS. And then finally, we can look at the presence of saw cuts and axe marks and so forth. And if we kind of loosely suck our eyes together and squint a little bit, we can actually identify periods when something obviously was happening. But it would be the early 19th century, where it's very clear that we know from the historical archives that there was a lot of timber cutting. It was the Napoleonic War period. But we can also look at the late 17th century, the early 16th century, and maybe even back into the 13th century, periods when there was a substantial reduction in the forest or a death that is represented in the archive that we're extracting from, at least in this case, from Rothy Mercus. And we definitely see the 1660s, 1690s, and the 1800s events in the Glenafric story as well, when we've got very good replication. So these are really clear regional signals of forest disturbance, essentially, and anthropogenic disturbance, with probably mostly man-related to cutting. Okay, so I'm a climatologist. I have to talk a little bit about climate, but this is fundamentally important because our climate is changing, and a changing climate is going to impact our trees, and we need to understand why. Okay, so I want to go back to this network here. And this is a really beautiful network. There are many papers still to be published in all of this. But one of the things we've done over the last maybe 7 years is we've actually sampled elevational transects down the the Spey, the Dee, and the Tweed valleys. That's why there's this anomalous scatter of pine trees. They're all plantations down here. But we now have a full elevational spectrum of pine trees growing from sea level up to upper tree line around 550 in the Cairngorms, and we essentially have a site out on average about every 15 meters of elevational steps. Now, this is sort of like a heat map here. Don't need to worry about it. But what this represents is the correlation between the density chronologies and monthly variables of temperature. Right? The details don't really matter. What I want you to see, though, is this very consistent, strong correlation to July and August temperatures. Now, it's this strong correlation that I talked about before with regards to these generally high elevation trees showing this beautiful summer temperature signal. And there's this summer temperature signal that we use for our reconstructions of past summer temperatures, right? And what is interesting, right, this is Glenderry. This is 540, so that's in Mar Lodge, going all the way down to sea level. So this is the Spey and the Tweed down here. And you can see that this response fades as we get away from tree line, right? Which fits with theory. We're losing temperature limitation, but actually this temperature limitation we see here really stays pretty strongly to around 250 meters above sea level, and then only then it starts fading. And then even at these lower elevations, then site ecology becomes more dominant. So SMC here, CRG, TRN, I'm not going to say the names of these sites, but these are all on very strange substrates, very thin soils or sandy soils, where the hydrology is extremely dry, where the temperature the limitation completely disappears. So substrate becomes really important at the low elevations of how these trees are responding to climate. But at high elevation, so for example, Green Lock here, these are trees on the talus slope. They don't care if they're on a talus slope. They're slow growing, but their climate response and the variability of growth as a function of temperature is bang on. And it's a beautiful site to work up with. So please remember that July-August signal, because it's really important to understand that this is a very dominant signal, at least in the east. It gets a little bit more complicated in the west. So this is just a quick plot of the extended temperature reconstruction that my PhD student Milos Riedval produced almost 10 years ago now. And so this is a mixture of living trees and subfossil material from the northern Cairngorms only. So Glen Affric's not involved there. There's no historical timbers from all the dating work. So this is work that will be updated, and I'm not publishing the update until we can do the full millennium. That's my aim. And so the number of trees in the sort of pre-1500 period is not as well replicated as we would like. But from about 1550 on, it's a really solid signal. And you can see the warming signal up into the recent period. The green line here is the instrumental data. And then you can see how miserable the 17th century must have been in Scotland and the late 17th century here. This is the period here. I've often when talked about the ills, where we had 7 years of famine. All these years are picked up in the Tree Ring archive extremely well. There's a beautiful, I could talk a whole hour just on this record, and it's a beautiful record, and trying to extend that back for 1,000 years or even 2,000 years is one of the aims that we're going to be doing in the next 5 years or so. But the aim of this work was not just to build a long reconstruction going back in time. We have a full network for the whole of Scotland. So we could also actually do spatial reconstruction. So we gridded Scotland into different grids related to the instrumental data. And of course, we don't have trees growing out on the Outer Hebrides, but we could still extrapolate and try to reconstruct all over these grids. Now, what I wanted to highlight, though, is that this figure here just shows you how well or how robust the calibration was, the statistical fit between the tree ring data and the climate data. And in this case, we're just calibrating in the early 20th century. We create a model, and then we try to then reconstruct forward in time so we can compare the reconstruction to the instrumental data, an independent validation step. And when we did that, we did a pretty good validation, even in the south of Scotland, where we have very little data, and certainly stronger in the Cairngorms. But as soon as we went to the west, then everything started breaking down, and our sort of modelling capacity weakened or broke down entirely. And at the time, that really, really frustrated me, because we maybe didn't quite have as much data as we had in the Cairngorms, but it really did seem to struggle. So we wanted to go further with that. So I'm going to very briefly sort of talk about some ongoing work that we're doing to try to understand what's happening here. So let's go back to this network here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare data from 3 regions. We're going to compare the northern Cairngorms, where everything in the Cairngorms works very well-behaved trees. And then we're going to just look at 2 sites in the west, or 2 regions, the southwest and what I call west central. And we're going to do a similar exercise, but this time we're going to use the climate data to try to predict what the tree growth should be doing. And we're going to calibrate, we're going to create a model in the early 20th century from 1902 to 1950. And then temperature and precipitation are going to be input variables. And we create a model, and then we use those climate variables to predict forward in time, and then we compare it. Okay, and then we do a validation post 1950. So this is the Cairngorms. And as I say, the Cairngorms, look at the model is in red. And the blue is the actual tree ring data for this region. And you can see the match is very good. If anyone's into statistics, it's explaining 80% of the variance. Brilliant. Here in this table here just shows which variables have gone in the model. So we have April, May, July, August, September temperatures. They go into the model with positive weighting. But notice June and August precipitation are also going in slightly negative. Now, that's not a surprise, because actually pine trees don't like it if it's too wet, right? If their roots get wet, they don't respire well, and so that's actually a negative. So there is this conflicting impact in the model, but if we use these variables and then we predict forward in time, then the prediction looks pretty darn good. And actually, if we just take the residual differences between these, so I just want to look at this is the error term here, it all generally looks pretty good. And the only one that really stands out here is 1961. 1961 is one of the thinnest rings, at least in the eastern part of Scotland, for the last 300 years. And climatologically, I cannot explain it. So there must have been maybe some sort of canopy stripping event, some localized storms in that part of Scotland, or something that impacted tree growth just really for 1 year. A very odd event. So if anyone has any ideas, I'd be very welcome. But otherwise, everything's working really well in the Cairngorms. So let's now go to the southwest. So this is using data from Collacollachute, which is near Tyndrum. I call it the 3C site, and then also Glenorchy. So these are slightly low elevation sites. Now the modelling is still pretty good. But this time, notice that different months are going in here. We've got temperature from April, June, and July. And now July and August precipitation are coming in. But notice the weighting of the precipitation is actually much more dominant in the west, right? We're now in a wetter environment, and the trees are really responding in a negative way to that excess precipitation. And if we propagate that model forward in time, it does okay. But if we look at the residuals, now you'll see in the very recent period, there's actually a relative crash in productivity that cannot be modeled based on the model based on the early 20th century. Okay, now let's just move up then to the West Central. So this is pine trees from Kona Glen, Glen Lloyd, Glen Nevis. We get basically the same sort of results. June and July temperatures going in, but again we get April, July, August going in with actually July and August are going in negatively again, and we propagate that forward and we look at the residuals, and again we see this crash in the recent period or relative slowing in productivity of the trees. And we can do this exercise all the way from Glen Orchy right up to Redolach, and we see the same signal in every site, that in the recent decade there seems to be this relative slowing down or decrease in productivity in the sites in the very recent period. Now, whether that is just purely a product that these trees are struggling because of excess precipitation still really remains to be shown. But let's just back out a little bit, right? So the controls on tree productivity and response are very different in the West. Okay, it's a much more wetter region here. The high elevations in the Cairngorms are almost predominantly controlled by summer temperatures with a little bit of sort of inverse correlation influence. But as soon as we get to the west, temperature has an influence, but the negative effects of precipitation is dominating, and actually the increasing dominance of that precipitation effects seems to be getting worse as we go forward in time. So if we actually look, so this is just a plot of of annual temperatures of Scotland. It's warmed, as we all know, of about close to 1.5 degrees since the 19th century to the recent period. And that's good because that means that the trees, at least in the eastern side of Scotland, are responding to that. So we're seeing increased productivity. The trees are responding to that trend as we would expect. But in Scotland as a whole, annual precipitation is also increasing, with the very recent periods substantially wetter than most of the other period prior to 1980. And it's this very recent period where we're starting to see this decrease in productivity in the recent period. And when we actually then show the network of pine chronologies over the gridded precipitation data here, these regions I highlighted here are in two of the wettest areas in the Scottish Highlands. So it does look as if the precipitation is having a substantial effect here. And the rate of increasing precipitation in the west is 3 times greater than we see in the Cairngorms. And actually precipitation or hydroclimate is really flatlining, and it's not really drying, it's not really increasing. It really depends on which season you look at. So the fundamental changes are all in the west. So this really has very potential implications about current pine productivity. If you're interested in regeneration, planting saplings, and management plans, I think these kind of factors are going to more and more have to be taken into account. If you're in the West and you're wanting to regenerate pine woodlands, you're probably going to need to target drier substrates at the very least, and maybe south-facing slopes to increase your chance that pine regeneration will occur. I think at the moment in the Cairngorms, there's absolutely no problem. Pine is like a weed, and you can look at really good examples in Abernethy and Mar Lodge where we see pine regenerating really well all over the place. Okay, so I'm getting close. I'm probably gone too long, so I'm going to very briefly finish off with oak. This is a brand new project here. Freddie Merker is a PhD student on this work. He's 1 year into his PhD, and we're about 2 years into this project, so it's not as advanced as the pine. One of the reasons I finally kind of got dragged kicking and screaming into this, because I knew oak would be way more complicated than pine, is because of this sort of shift to the western temperate rainforest and all of this interesting stuff. But the reality is we know very little about oak dendrochronology and how these trees have, what is controlling oak growth in Scotland. I have some work, or have done some work in southern England, where it's kind of a drought signal down there, but we don't have a drought problem in Scotland. So what's really controlling the oak? And we've already seen that there may be some beginnings of evidence that the pines struggling in the recent period in the West. Well, how about the oak woodlands? So this was really one of the reasons to start doing at least some preliminary work to try to understand oak up in Scotland. So this is the map of the pine network, just to give you, and that's taken 20 years to build up, and it's a beautiful data set, but it does take time. But in 2 years, we have sampled quite a lot of oak, actually. It's when you've got a team, and there's several of you, and you're getting, and thank you to any landowners who've given us permission. We're actually doing pretty well. We're going to do another year's worth of sampling. So we're doing some in the Aberdeenshire area. We'd love to go down to Ayrshire to fill up some of these gaps. There's oak everywhere. So there's no shortage of this, but unlike the pines, where most of the pines we've sampled were in semi-natural woodlands, oak is anything from estates to maybe natural sites in the sort of western regions to a real agglomeration of very different site types, which is making it even more complex. So it's kind of interesting. So we've got a new study and a new network working here. And very briefly, I'm just going to do a quick comparison. We've got, because Kat told me I had to talk about Cashel, so we're going to talk about the Cashel woodland that we sampled earlier this year, and then also I'm going to compare that to Loch Katrine, which is just the nearest site here. So what sort of things can we do? First thing, we can just do some simple stand dynamics here. This is just the number. We've sampled 30 trees here. You can see the age structure of the individual trees, and then this is just the histogram of the start dates, or the first dates. In this case, the first dates measured. Okay, so it's not entirely the PIF date. But you can see that this is a relatively even age woodland where probably it's a plantation and was planted, or at least regeneration started sometime from the late 1880s right through to the early 20th century. Okay, now if we compare that to the similar kind of data that we get from Loch Katrine, now this is a very interesting landscape. It's an abandoned landscape where we've got different phases of oak regeneration, and Corley Mills and Peter Quelch have done a lot of work here doing woodland surveys, and we've got many more trees actually from this location. But here you can see a much more broader age structure in this woodland for this particular location we identified. Now, just for context, if I was down in England and I sampled 2 oak sites that were about 15 kilometers away, as Cashel and Loch Katrine is, and then I matched the chronologies together, they would lock on and show exactly the same signal. Central England is basically flat. The climate's the same. There's very little topography. And even if there might be a little bit of management differences, they cross-state extremely well together. So I thought, well, how about Cashel and Loch Katrine? Well, if we compare these chronologies here, and this is just the running correlation, just for these 2 sites, they start off reasonably strongly correlated in the early 20th century, but after around the 1950s, they crash, and they do different things in the last 60, 70 years or so. And actually comparing these sites with all the other ones around, which I didn't have time to show, the problem in inverted commas here is Loch Katrine. Cashel and Lenny and Callender and those oak woodlands we've sampled compare very nicely with each other. So there is a different signal happening in Loch Katrine that at the moment we have no idea what that may represent, but clearly they're getting decoupled from the sort of broad scale signal in the area. So that's the sort of exercises that we can start doing when we have these networks where we compare all the sites together. They're not all coherent, and actually this crash in correlation has implications when we want to date buildings. Sometimes when we don't date buildings, it might be because the data is really representing an odd signal, and it's a problem, and we need to try and understand that. Just very briefly, I want to jump to the large scale. So as well as the Scottish network that we're actually been sampling actively the last 2 years, there is actually a lot of oak chronologies from England and Ireland. Most of that is from archaeological and historical dating work, although I did some climatological work in southern England with isotopes and with the Swansea group about 15 years ago. And so we can do the same sort of correlation heat map exercises just to see what the broad scale responses are in all of these. So this is Scotland in this block, Ireland here, and England here, and these are correlations. So red is a positive correlation, blue is an inverse correlation, and this is to temperature. So in Scotland, we kind of surprisingly see the same kind of July-August response that we see in the pine ring width data. Now this I did not expect, and actually turns out that the oak ring width chronologies correlate or cross-date with the pine. So there is a common response in Scotland. Ireland is subtly different, where we may loosely, you can see there's lots of gaps here. It's very noisy data, but May, June is kind of the swing. And then we get to England, and then we just see a relatively tight common signal for some of the sites for May. And there's clearly lots of things happening here. This is the very first cut that we just played around last week. So that was with temperature. And then if we go to, this is SPEI, so Standardized Precipitation Evaporation Index. It's a drought index. Now, Scotland is very different here. Most of the sites are showing some sort of weird response to previous November, December, so essentially an early winter signal. Ireland is very late in the season, where we got August, September. And then we get to the English material, and then it's, again, July, August precipitation or hydroclimate. And it's this signal that we use for doing the hydroclimate reconstructions back in England. Now, this is all very broad scale stuff, but all I wanted to highlight is that oak within these regions are relatively coherent, but the oak trees in Scotland and Ireland and England are all actually expressing a slightly different response to climate, with Ireland being transitional and Ireland being slightly closer to the English material and Scotland being quite unique. And that's all I can say at this time. It's very, very early days, but we have got an increasingly beautiful data set here as well to help us understand oak over space and time. So I am at the end, and I apologize if I went over a bit time. Hopefully I've given you an idea that tree rings can provide a broad sort of swath of applications for environmental sciences in general. It's not just climate, not just for dating buildings, but we can do all sorts of ecological work. And they're a super archive for studying past environmental and climate change. And I've shifted, personally, I'm shifting more away from looking back and reconstructing past climate to try to use the current period where we can model the response to current climate, whether that's climate over space or over time, and try to understand how these woodlands may perform, in inverted commas, in a changing world. You know, if it is going to get wetter by 10%, what is the implication for pine? What is the implications for oak? And I think that from a management point of view is really profoundly important, because, you know, who cares what the temperature really was in 1602, right? But people are going to care about what's going to be there happening to the forest by 2050. But ultimately, all of this, the dating is crucial. Okay, and I just want to go back to that thing. But by getting the dating, then we can do this very robust statistical modeling by matching climate data to the tree ring data and so forth, so we can come up with these models. So apologies for going slightly over time. It's very difficult to keep in the online world. So thank you very much, and I will stop sharing. Many people have helped with this work. It's certainly not just me as well over the years.
Oh, Rob, thank you so much for that talk. You're a time-traveling tree detective, and it was just so fascinating to hear how the learning is steering the story and where you're going to go with it. Really, really brilliant. Thank you. I know we're at 8 o'clock, but we might have a few minutes left for questions if anybody has a question that they want to ask. So I'll pause for a second in case anyone wants to put their virtual hand up, or actual hand up if your camera's on. I'll be able to see you wave it.
There might be questions in the chat. I don't know, was there?
Just checking. Don't think we've got any questions just there.
It was a dry suit. Yes, yeah.
We've got a question from Keith. Keith, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Oh, Keith, I'm not hearing anything coming through. Sorry, if you're... No, still nothing. If you're able to type your question in the chat box, we could maybe pick it up from there.
Yep, that'll be the best way to do it.
Yeah.
Is that Nanda waving his hand, maybe?
Oh, Nanda, you're waving your hand. There we go.
Yeah, I was just going to comment about 1961. I remember it being an extraordinarily hard and tough winter, and there was snow lying on the ground for probably about 3 months, and I mean, it was just unreal. And the spring that year, there was hardly a songbird left in the garden. So I think the climate record or the weather record would tell you that it was an extraordinarily tough winter.
It's funny you should say this, because we have looked at least at we haven't looked at daily data, but we've looked at monthly variables of precipitation, which would be snow, and there's nothing that stands out. But it is possible that if you had prolonged snow that was causing stripping of some of the canopies, and if it was, say, worse in the eastern part of Scotland, so you can get quite substantial canopy impacts that will then be expressed in the ring width of the following year. But usually the problem is then that would in fact impact growth for multiple years and not just that single year. And the trees don't really start growing until March. So it's the fact that the density data picks it up, and the density is picking up a July-August signal. It's very difficult to explain. I mean, we have tried, we have looked at that kind of detail, but we can look at it. Yeah, I'm not quite old enough to remember 61, so it's
yeah.
Rob, we've got Keith's question in the chat now. He's asking, is Loch Katrine more wood pasture?
I think originally it was, yes. I think you'd have to speak to Coralie Mills or Peter Quelch for the history there, but the southern part of the loch, the whole expanse was a pasture area that has been abandoned, and then at least for the last 200 years has essentially just been left to naturalize, and then the oak trees have expanded over the old pasture. So if you go into these woodlands, and it's pretty rough to walk through some of this area, you can see the old field lines and walls and crofts, and they're all within the forest now. And there's lots of coppice trees in there. So we sample no coppice trees for this oak work at the moment. That's more but you can date coppices and pollarded trees reasonably well with the tree ring approach as well. So yeah, that's very much a cultural. So there would be, I'm sure if you Googled, there must be a report from Dendrochronicle out there with Coralie's name and Peter Quelch about the Loch Katrine woodlands. It's amazing walking with people like that in such woodlands, because I just see trees and they see the landscape below the trees. Yeah, and it's it's great.
Super. A question from Simon.
Hi, Rob. Yeah, you have to be careful with chainsaws and dry suits. You don't want it to leak. We're coming back to the West Coast pines, because I think we talked about this at the Pine Conference and things like that as well. Yeah. That you've got what's a mainly continental species on its maritime margins.
Yep.
Your information seems to hint that we might be on a losing streak on that. What?
I don't know. So we're updating some of the sites now. So the southwest sites we've updated, so they should go up to 2024 now. We haven't done the updated analysis on that, and we've just now gone up to Glen Affrig, Shieldaig, Loch Marie to do the sites up there. And then it would be great to go back to the sort of the great glen sites like Cona Glen and Glen Nevis to see if this continues. I mean, it could be just a short-term wobble, right? The trees could, but I agree with you. I would be surprised, but it would be, this is the problem when you've only got a relatively small number of years when it deviates. We talked about 61 before. That was 1 year and then they bounced back. But now we're kind of 10 years into this decline that seems to be prevalent in most of the sites. Another issue, partly in the West as well, that the tree line, the upper tree line, is not really natural. I mean, we can see with the mineral soil preserved material in the peats, if in Glen Affrig and Medieval, that you can actually find stumps at 550, the same level as you would see in the Cairngorms. But the living stock's much lower. It's maybe 350 at the highest in Glen Affrig. So that lower elevation means that it's actually climatologically quite different to the high elevations in the Cairngorm. So there is this other aspect of them being slightly lower and a bit warmer and a bit wetter. I don't think, I've been very careful, and I apologize. I've tried not to use the term pine decline, because I think it's because the trees are just doing what they do. They're growing slower because conditions are not optimal, but it may not necessarily mean that they're going to die off, right? I'd like to think that that's not the case at all. But it just might mean, it might explain why some areas are a little bit more problematic for regeneration and planting and all of that. And it just might mean the climate's going to get wetter. That's for sure. It's going to get windier as well, especially in the West. So all these are just extra stresses that I think we need to just keep in mind. I don't think and you could find sheltered sites and south-facing slopes on better drained soils, and I'm sure the pines will do fairly well. And you might find that a little bit of selective planting of trees that are doing well in wetter, windier areas might behave better. You know, but that's not my thing. I'm just sort of, this is what the data shows. And if it was just the odd site, I wouldn't worry. But when it's pretty much all the sites, then, you know, I think that's something that we need to be aware of. I mean, again, I said this at the Pine Woodland Conference, it's not published yet, you know, it's really frustrating. And so, you know, it's just finding the time. It's it's getting there.
Thank you. Rob, I think we could chat about this for a whole extra hour, but I'm conscious of time, so we might have to wrap up there. But can I just say on behalf of everybody, thanks again for giving up your time this evening. I know what a busy day job you've got, and to share your evening with us has been a real pleasure. So thank you again, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it, and see everyone soon.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.